I was 38, a judge with a spotless record, a calendar full of cases, and a name people spoke with respect, yet every night, when the house grew quiet and the city lights softened to a glow, an ache opened in my chest that no verdict could close. I had climbed the ladder and discovered the wall behind it was bare. Have you ever arrived somewhere and realized it wasn't home? I knew the rituals, the language of reverence, the posture of a believer, but faith, real faith, had thinned into routines I could perform in my sleep. I checked every box and somehow missed my own heart. In court, I weighed evidence, but in private, I ignored the evidence of my soul fatigue that coffee couldn't cure, prayers that sounded right but landed flat, a restlessness that followed me like a shadow into every room. Success is a gifted tailor. It can stitch a suit that hides a wound. I told myself to press on. More discipline, more hours, more excellence. But excellence without meaning is a treadmill, plenty of motion, no arrival. I began to notice the small tells, how I lingered in the corridor after a ruling, hoping to feel something, how I envied the janitor humming softly at dawn, how a child's laughter in the lobby pierced me with a question I couldn't name. What if the life I'd built was impressive and insufficient? One evening I stood at my window as the city pulsed below and whispered, God, is there more? Not louder prayers, truer ones, not bigger tasks, deeper life. I thought of a tree by the river. You don't command it to bear fruit. You plant it near water and fruit comes in season. I had camped in the courthouse when my roots were thirsty for a living stream. That awareness didn't shame me, it invited me. It said, you're not broken, you're being beckoned. So I started small, 5 honest minutes before dawn, closing the case file and opening my heart, telling the truth no one else would hear. I'm empty, and I need you. I practiced gratitude like rehab for my soul, naming mercies I'd sprinted past the warmth of tea, the kindness of a clerk, the sky rinsed clean after rain. And slowly, like light seeping under a door, presence replaced performance. The gavel in my hand didn't change, but the grip on my heart did. Friend, titles are useful, but they're not anchors. Applause is pleasant, but it's not oxygen. If your success is loud and your spirit is quiet, that quiet is not failure, it's a holy summons. Answer it, and you'll find what I found. When God fills the inner room, the outer rooms finally make sense. It happened on an ordinary day that turned extraordinary. I was in court, surrounded by the rhythm of law and logic, my mind fixed on verdicts and arguments. The world of order was all I knew. But in one unguarded moment, everything shifted. A sharp pain gripped my chest, sudden, fierce, unrelenting. The walls blurred, voices faded, and the gavel slipped from my hand. I remember the echo of it striking wood as everything went still. Then, silence. Have you ever stood between two worlds, the one you know and one you can't describe? That's where I found myself. My body lay motionless, but my spirit was awake, alive in a way it had never been. I was pulled into a vast expanse of light, not the kind that burns the eyes, but one that soothes the soul. It was peace, pure and endless. Every fear, every regret I had ever carried was stripped away. I could feel love so tangible it wrapped around me like warm air after a storm. I didn't see walls or ceilings, only an ocean of brilliance. I wasn't afraid. In that place, I understood something I'd never known in all my years of judgment and intellect, that the human soul is not made for endless striving, it's made for belonging. I realized how small my world had been, how often I measured worth by titles and tasks, how I had missed the quiet call of eternity whispering beneath the noise of ambition. For a moment, I stood outside of time. The worries of yesterday and the plans for tomorrow disappeared, and all that remained was presence, holy, unshakable presence. It was as if God had paused the clock just long enough to show me that the light I sought was never in achievement but in surrender. And then, as quickly as I had left, I began to fall back through layers of sound, back into the weight of a beating heart, back into the room where people shouted my name. I opened my eyes to the faces of fear and relief. The paramedics were working, my colleagues were praying, and I realized I had been given a second chance not to chase more, but to live deeper. Friend, sometimes life has to break us open before it can fill us. When the heart stops, heaven speaks. You don't have to wait for a collapse to listen. Even now, in your still moments, that same light is calling you not to escape this world, but to see it anew, through the eyes of grace. When my heart stopped, time did too. In that silent expanse where breath had no meaning, I found myself standing in a light that words can't quite hold. It wasn't blinding, it was alive. It pulsed with warmth, with truth, with something I'd spent my whole life searching for but never knew by name. And then, through that radiance, a voice called me. Not loud, not forceful, but so full of authority and love that it seemed to echo through the very fabric of my being. Imran, just one word, and yet it was everything. I turned, and there he was, Jesus. I had known of him, studied him as history, heard his name in whispers, but now I knew him as reality. His eyes held eternity, and in them I saw no judgment, no accusation, only understanding, only grace. It felt as though he saw every page of my story, every doubt, every ambition, every secret ache, and still called me his. He didn't speak in long sermons. He didn't need to. Each word he uttered was alive, full of power and peace. He showed me how the world I'd lived in was not just a courtroom of laws, but a battlefield of souls. He revealed how fear had become humanity's silent ruler, how entire systems thrived on control and division. They tell you to fear, he said, but fear is the enemy's greatest lie. Love is your true authority. As he spoke, I saw flashes, nations rising against nations, people divided by labels, faiths used as walls instead of bridges. I saw how easily hearts were manipulated when disconnected from truth, and in that vision, I realized I wasn't being condemned, I was being awakened. I thought of my own life, the robes, the respect, the rituals, and saw how much of it had been built on fear of losing approval, fear of being wrong, fear of being unloved. Jesus looked at me, and suddenly, all that fear dissolved. In his presence, I understood that truth isn't a doctrine, it's a person. Love wasn't something to earn, it was the atmosphere of heaven itself. I felt my heart fill with a peace I had never known, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstance, the kind that whispers, "You were never alone." And then, as quickly as it began, the light began to fade, but his words remained burned into my soul like fire. When I opened my eyes again in that hospital room, I carried not just the memory of an encounter, but the mission born from it, to live no longer by fear, but by the freedom of truth. Because once you've heard Jesus call your name, you can never be the same again. As I stood in that radiant light, Jesus' gaze seemed to pierce through every layer of illusion that had ever blinded me. The peace around me was unshakable, yet what he began to show me shook my very soul. In an instant, the light around us shifted, and I was no longer standing in stillness. I was watching the world unfold as if through his eyes. I saw nations in chaos, leaders shaking hands while hiding daggers behind their backs, voices on screens preaching fear instead of truth. I saw men and women divided not by truth, but by lies carefully crafted to keep them apart. The stage was global, but the puppeteers were few. This, Jesus said softly, is not just politics or power, it's a war for the soul. And I understood then that the greatest battle on earth isn't fought with weapons, it's fought in the heart and the mind. I watched how fear was sold like a currency, how news and narratives kept people anxious and distracted, chasing false promises while missing the quiet whisper of the divine. I saw religion twisted into chains instead of wings, faith turned into a competition instead of a communion. It wasn't that truth had vanished, it had been buried under noise. They feed the world division, he continued, because divided hearts are easy to control. But love, real love, cannot be manipulated. Every word struck me like lightning and healing all at once. It wasn't anger, I felt it was sorrow. I realized how I, too, had lived under those same illusions, thinking my robe of authority made me strong, when in truth, I was another captive, dressed in pride. In that revelation, the world looked different. The systems I once respected now seemed fragile, like glass towers built on sand. Yet, amid the darkness, I could also see light, ordinary people standing up for truth, kindness, defying corruption, faith quietly pushing back against fear. It dawned on me that this spiritual war wasn't just happening somewhere out there, it was happening in each of us. Every day we choose between fear and faith, bitterness and compassion, silence and courage. Then Jesus looked at me again, and his voice became a calm command. You've seen the battle. Now go and remind them truth still wins. That moment became the mission that would define my life. Because once you've seen the world through heaven's eyes, you can never unsee it. And you realize the greatest revolution begins not in palaces or parliaments, but in one awakened heart that refuses to live in fear anymore. When I opened my eyes in that hospital room, the world looked the same, but I was not. The beeping machines, the scent of antiseptic, the worried faces hovering above me, all familiar. Yet inside, something had shifted so completely that it felt as though I had been reborn into another life. I could still feel the echo of that heavenly light, the peace that had wrapped around me like a living presence. It wasn't just a memory, it was a message imprinted on my soul. In that moment I knew I couldn't go back to who I was. The man who chased status, who found comfort in rituals and rules, had been left on the other side of that light. The judge in me had died, but the witness in me had awakened. For the first time, everything made sense. I realized I had spent years defending the laws of man, but had never truly discovered the laws of grace. I had pursued justice, yet had never tasted mercy. I had known about God, but I hadn't known God. And that difference changes everything. When you've glimpsed eternity, the noise of the world fades into background static. The titles, the opinions, the applause, they lose their power, but clarity comes with its own cross. As I lay there recovering, another kind of pain began, the fear of what this truth would cost me. Would my friends understand? Would my family stand by me? Or would they see me as a traitor to the traditions that once defined me? It's a strange thing when light enters your life. It doesn't just illuminate, it exposes. I saw the illusion I had once lived in, the striving, the pretending, the endless need to prove myself worthy. It was all smoke, and I had mistaken it for substance. Now I could see that life isn't about climbing ladders. It's about walking in freedom. The heart that once chased perfection now longed for presence. I found myself whispering, Lord, if you've brought me back, it must be for a reason. Show me what to do with this second chance. And that's when purpose began to bloom quietly within me. It didn't arrive with fireworks. It came like dawn, slow and certain. I felt a call to share what I'd seen, to tell others that love is stronger than fear, that truth isn't hidden, it's waiting for a willing heart. Still, the old fears lingered. The judge in me feared judgment. But The voice that had called my name in that light reminded me, you don't have to be understood to be faithful. Just be willing. And so, trembling yet transformed, I took my first step into a life that wasn't about defending the law anymore, but living the truth I had finally found. When I finally gathered the courage to share what had happened to me, I thought people would see the light in my eyes and understand. I thought they would feel what I had felt, that love beyond words, that peace that erased every fear. But instead, I was met with silence, then whispers, and soon, outright rejection. My family looked at me as if I had lost my mind. Friends who once sought my counsel now avoided my gaze. The same community that once applauded my judgments now judged me. Overnight, I went from respected Judge Imran to the man who betrayed his faith. And let me tell you, the pain of losing belonging is sharper than any blade. You expect enemies to misunderstand you, but when love turns away, it leaves a hollow echo in your chest. There were nights when I sat alone in my study, the air thick with questions. God, did I really hear you? Did I imagine it all? If this truth is from you, why does it cost so much? Maybe you've been there too, doing the right thing, but losing people because of it. That's when faith stops being theory and becomes oxygen. In those dark hours, I learned that isolation is not abandonment, it's refinement. Sometimes, before God lifts you, He separates you. Before He gives you a platform, He gives you solitude. It's in the quiet places that conviction grows roots. I remember walking through the marketplace one morning, hearing my name whispered with contempt. Yet in that humiliation, I felt a strange calm. Jesus' voice echoed in my heart. They hated me first. And I realized something powerful: being rejected by man doesn't mean you've been rejected by God. In fact, it often means you're standing closer to His truth than ever before. The pain I felt became a kind of holy fire, burning away the last traces of pride, teaching me compassion even for those who turned against me. Because the truth is, they weren't my enemies, they were afraid. I used to be afraid too. What I discovered in that season is that loneliness can become sacred space. When everyone else leaves, God sits closer. He whispers in the silence, "Keep walking." So I did. Each day, I rose and prayed for those who cursed me. I stopped seeking approval and started seeking presence. And that's when peace returned, not the peace that comes from being accepted, but the peace that comes from being anchored. If you've ever lost everything for standing by truth, remember this: rejection isn't the end, it's proof that your transformation is real. When God calls you out of the crowd, it's not to leave you empty, it's to set you apart for something greater. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world outside my window slept, I began a different kind of search, not for legal truth, but for eternal truth. I would open the Bible in secret, my hands trembling, my heart racing, as though every turn of a page might expose me. I had spent my whole life studying laws written by men. Now I was reading words breathed by God, and what struck me most wasn't the complexity, it was the simplicity. Perfect love casts out fear. Those words echoed through me like a key turning in a long locked door. For years, I had lived in a world governed by fear, fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of losing everything familiar. But this book spoke a different language. It spoke of grace, freedom, and a love that didn't demand performance. I started connecting quietly with others who, like me, had walked the same narrow bridge between two worlds. We met in hidden corners of cafes, in small apartments lit by a single lamp, our voices hushed but our hearts burning. Each story was different, but the thread was the same: we had all been found by a love we didn't go looking for. One man told me how he'd lost his family for his faith, another how he'd found joy amid rejection. In their words, I found a reflection of my own struggle. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. It was as if heaven had stitched together a small band of broken souls just to remind us that God never leaves his seekers wandering in the dark. The more I listened, the more I realized that our individual stories were part of something far greater, a war that wasn't fought with weapons, but with whispers. A spiritual war not for land or power, but for hearts and minds. The enemy wasn't a person or a nation, it was fear itself, masquerading as religion, as politics, as pride. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I recognized how deeply humanity was manipulated not by visible chains, but invisible lies. Lies that told us to hate what was different, to compete instead of connect, to worship rules instead of relationship. In those secret gatherings, I felt the veil lifting. I began to understand that truth doesn't just set you free, it makes you brave. Because when you've tasted real freedom, you can no longer live pretending. Every night I walked home through the narrow streets, my heart pounding, my spirit alive. I wasn't just learning scripture, I was living revelation. And I knew that someday, somehow, the truth we whispered in secret would have to be spoken out loud, no matter the cost. There comes a moment in every story when silence can no longer hold truth. For me, that moment arrived like sunrise after a long night. I had spent months hiding, studying, praying, trying to understand why God would choose someone like me, a man once bound by pride and fear, to carry such a message. But one morning, as light poured through my window, I felt it deep in my spirit. It's time. Time to speak, time to stand, time to live unashamed of the truth that had set me free. I knew that the man named Imran, the judge, the scholar, the man bound by tradition, was gone. In his place stood someone reborn in purpose. I took a new name, Hamza, the steadfast one. It wasn't just a name change. It was a declaration that my life no longer belonged to fear, but to freedom. At first, I didn't know where to begin. How do you tell people that everything you once believed about power, control, and faith had been turned upside down by love? I started small, sharing my story with one person, then another. Some listened with tears, others with disbelief. But even in their doubts, I saw something stirring hope, curiosity, a flicker of light behind tired eyes. I began to see that the world didn't need another debate. It needed a reminder that truth still breathes, that love still breaks chains. The same Jesus who called me in that realm of light was now calling me to speak light into dark places. And yes, fear tried to whisper its old lies. They'll reject you. You'll lose everything. But by then, I had learned the secret. Fear only has power when you listen. So I tuned my heart to faith instead. I began to travel, to meet others who were searching. In small gatherings, I would tell my story not as a preacher, but as a witness. I spoke of the love that met me when I least deserved it, the grace that rewrote my life's verdict, the truth that isn't a concept but a person named Jesus. I told them that the world we see isn't the whole story, that beneath the noise, a spiritual war rages for our hearts, but love has already won. Every time I spoke, I saw lives begin to awaken, faces softening, hearts opening. People who had lived under fear began to breathe again. And in those moments, I understood my mission wasn't to argue religion, it was to awaken souls. My job wasn't to convince, it was to shine. Because when you've walked through darkness and found light, you don't keep it to yourself. You hold it high so others can find their way home too. There were days when I wondered if the cost was too high, when the faces of those I loved turned away, when my name was whispered like a warning instead of a blessing. But every time I felt the sting of rejection, God reminded me that purpose often begins in pain. So I pressed on. Little by little, A handful of seekers began to gather people from different walks of life, carrying their own bruised hearts and unanswered questions. We met quietly at first, sharing stories that sounded like echoes of one another's. There was the young man who'd lost faith in religion but hadn't lost his hunger for truth. There was the mother who prayed in secret, torn between loyalty to tradition and the pull of something deeper. As we sat together, something powerful began to form, not an organization but a family. Not a church of walls, but of hearts. I called them seekers, because that's what we all were, souls, searching for light in a world that kept dimming it. We talked about what I had seen in that realm of peace, about how fear and control had ruled too long, dividing people who were made to walk in unity. And I told them, we're not here to tear anything down, we're here to lift people up. Slowly, hope began to replace despair. These gatherings became sanctuaries of honesty. We didn't need perfection, we needed presence. We didn't debate doctrine, we practiced love. And love, I found, is the most revolutionary truth of all. Of course, the world doesn't celebrate those who wake up. The same forces that profit from fear tried to silence us. There were threats, slander, attempts to break our resolve. But faith has a strange way of turning pressure into purpose. The more resistance we faced, the stronger our bond grew. We weren't just surviving, we were awakening. I began to see that this was never about me. It was about reminding others that they, too, were born for freedom. That beyond politics, beyond religion, beyond the noise, there is a spiritual war for our hearts, but we are not powerless. Sometimes people ask me, Hamza, aren't you afraid? I smile and tell them, courage isn't the absence of fear, it's trusting that love is stronger, and that's what keeps me moving forward. Because every time one soul breaks free from lies, every time someone finds peace where there used to be pain, the darkness loses ground. We may be small in number, but light doesn't need a crowd, it just needs to shine. As I look back on this journey from a judge lost in routine to a man reborn in truth, I see how every heartbreak, every loss, every lonely night was leading me here. What I once thought was punishment was actually preparation. I had to lose everything I depended on so I could discover the one I could truly depend on. That's why today I stand before you, not with a sermon, but with a calling. A calling for hearts to awaken, for souls to remember who they are, and for humanity to rise above the fear that has kept us divided for far too long. We are not enemies, we are family. We are not strangers, we are children of the same love. And that love has a name, Jesus. He didn't come to build walls between faiths. He came to tear them down. He didn't come to control hearts. He came to set them free. That's the heartbeat of truth from beyond, the movement that was born out of my pain but now lives through His purpose. It's not an organization, it's an awakening. A place where questions are welcome, where seekers find belonging, and where fear loses its grip. Because when light enters the room, darkness doesn't argue, it disappears. I've seen it happen in small villages and crowded cities, in whispered prayers and tearful confessions. When people encounter love that asks for nothing but their hearts, something miraculous happens, they begin to see clearly again. So, I'm inviting you not to follow me, but to walk with me. To become part of this global awakening that says, enough. Enough manipulation. Enough division. Enough living small when God designed us for greatness. The world doesn't need louder anger, it needs deeper compassion. It doesn't need another argument about truth, it needs people who live it. And that begins with you. Wherever you are, whatever you've done, the invitation stands. Step out of fear and into freedom. My friend, I don't know what battles you're fighting, but I do know this: when you dare to stand in truth, heaven stands with you. So lift your eyes, let go of the guilt, silence the lies, and remember, The light that found me is reaching for you too. It's time for the world to wake up. Time to trade fear for faith, division for unity, and confusion for clarity. The shaking has come, but so has the awakening. The world is waiting for the sons and daughters of truth to rise. Let's rise together.